Yeah, I'm losing my edge. I'm losing my edge.
One of my favorite scenes in the cult TV comedy drama You're the Worst comes midway in the second season. A distinctly odd, self-contained episode where you don't even see the dysfunctional couple at the core for several minutes, instead focusing on another couple just down the street. They're married, they've got a child that they're trying to get into a good preschool. The wife has a slightly better job than the husband, who is struggling with his film restoration business and his band, but they're doing okay. They see other couples at the bar and they reminisce about their past, their good old days. For our main female protagonist, actually seeing this couple, it's a glimpse into a possible future of what commitment could really mean long term. And she does a few truly horrific things then trying to LARP in it. But by the very end, she talks it out with the couple and she gets two answers. The wife highlights how it's hard, but seems like it was all worth it. That buying in was maybe the punk rock choice. To quote her directly,
"Conventional and scary, hell yeah. But the death of fun? Not necessarily. To be a slave to an idea of coolness is why some of your friends never grow, and in the end are actually less themselves, and counterintuitively live less authentic lives than the buyers in."
But her husband isn't so sure.
You like LCD sound system?
Not really.
I know what you mean.
Anyway, I just want you to know, you guys are great.
Are we?
And if you know that band, you get why. I mean, I don't like LCD Sound System at all, but I get them. They were pretty damn effective at cutting through to late Gen X and early millennial hipsters about the feeling that the best years of your life are slipping away. You're losing your religion, losing your edge, and you don't really know what you really want. To engage sincerely with those thoughts can be incredibly challenging. I'd argue the band themselves don't always do it as well, as they know a certain comfort zone is going to pay the bills, especially as you get older and your choices have deeper, lingering impacts. And the episode ends with the female protagonist quietly sobbing as she walks away, with the stark realization that you can live the life of still having it all together, that you can have the right relationship, and it still might not be enough. And it might not fix the wounds that cut a little bit deeper, where you have to do the work. The past couple weeks, that episode's lingered on my mind, especially as social media has once again decided to try to relitigate what hipsters and their culture was in the 2000s and 2010s, where even the major publications who are looking for the relevance they once had in that era to wade into the discourse. And when I say that, I mean the writers behind those publications who were probably there on the ground, you're not sure all the time. I've watched many of those writers draw their bubbles, trying to carve their niche of who was there in their place at their time. Bubbles that only seem to contract, not expand. It reminds me a lot of the political connotations around hipsters that in 2011, when I was on that debate team in university, because of course I was, we literally had the debate topic prefaced by a cute clip from the cult TV show Community. I want to say Jeff or Britta were featured talking about hipsters. That would make a lot of sense. But by 2011, many would argue the whole hipster archetype was dying, if not already dead, which is why network TV picked up on it. Ironically, when folks would start associating with more of the stomp, clap, mainstream, accessible folk scene, which has both more and less overlap with that archetype than folks seem to want to admit. I mean, I wasn't there for the whole hipster era, but I was there for enough to know. I saw it happen. But it's not fully about that either. This is about aging. It's about hipster culture. And it's about why a bunch of those so-called hipsters a decade ago tend to really like Olivia Rodrigo, especially this third album now, and why some who want to be the hipsters of the 2020s are already brewing the next backlash for whatever that is. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and delve into the newest album from Olivia Rodrigo, You Seem Pretty Sad for a Girl in Love, and why the hipster dies lonely. Part 1. Olivia Rodrigo doesn't need an introduction, but she actually might.
I want to be like Nessie.
I mean, you all know who Olivia Rodrigo is. She's been an active hitmaker in the Hot 100 since 2021, where her lead-off single at the beginning of the year went straight to #1 for weeks, and that was preceded by fame coming off the Disney Channel. She was on a show with Jake Paul for 2 seasons, for God's sakes. From there, she's got 3 Grammys, she's headlined tours and festivals. Her albums have received critical respect, if not acclaim, more on that in a bit, and in general, if you're familiar with her music, it's hard to find people who don't generally like her, especially nowadays once the tension between her and Sabrina Carpenter got ironed out. There is stan drama and schisms across fandoms, but they often seem to be rooted in the argument of whether Olivia Rodrigo has given her influences enough credit, most notably Hayley Williams of Paramore, or most likely Taylor Swift, rather than an outright dismissal of her music or her talent, a reputation that's only seemed to get better with each encroaching album. And let's make this clear. This was a reputation reinforced by a lot of mainstream critics, and I'm going to use the unfortunately now defunct Uproxx Critic Aggregate poll as evidence, where critics spanning the major press outlets and even YouTube, including myself, would vote or wrote in their picks for the best albums of various years. In 2021, Olivia Rodrigo's debut album, Sour, was second on that list. In 2023, her sophomore album, Guts, was also second on that list. Now, it's not out of the ordinary in our poptimist times that an act like her might get this much attention or acclaim, where I only need to go back to 2019 and see, in second place, Billie Eilish's debut album, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? She would also get on the Uproxx aggregate for her next 2 albums, albeit not placing quite as highly, but it's that 2019 breakthrough that stands out. It's not just one outlet or tastemaker that's driving this larger conversation. These are pop-adjacent young women, well supported by the industry, who stepped up to the plate with star-making material, where the mainstream was on board, and so were a lot of critics. And well, as of right now, I think Billie Eilish might still have the edge for her 2021 album, Happier Than Ever, which I think is now a little underappreciated in this time. Olivia Rodrigo's not far behind, and may even be neck and neck with her specifically for this new album. But why? Again, what makes Olivia Rodrigo so special? Why do folks like her so much? Why do so many young girls and women like her, but also their dads or their uncles? Older guys who seem to appreciate her music more than the stereotypically creepy way that men of that age tend to like young female pop stars. Why are so many critics of every age seemingly on board when a Disney starlet with full industry backing and success right out of the gate is not someone that they would be primed to like? If there is a backlash towards Olivia Rodrigo that is worth caring about, as in nobody should give a shit about whatever stan nonsense is happening on live, for the love of all that's holy, stop posting on Twitter. It seems at least partially directed at some of the critics who have liked her and praised her, who would have given her a pass when they may not have for others. And there is a slight grain of truth in exploring that, even as a non-fan of Sabrina Carpenter who has been trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Believe me, I have. I've not seen her get nearly as much grace as Olivia Rodrigo has. So there are some simple answers to these questions, but they drive more complicated follow-ups, especially around Olivia Rodrigo's critically acclaimed 3rd album, You Seem Pretty Sad for a Girl So in Love. And let's start with the easiest answer, where I know to some it's really not that deep. Why do folks like Olivia Rodrigo? That's easy. She's a damn good, if not great, pop star, especially in the mainstream. As a singer, she hits the easy balance between the softer whisper singing of the 2010s and a more classically trained pop balladeer, and she can deliver a fantastic live show. At my bachelor party last year in 2025, we went to a music festival. She was headlining. Like Billie Eilish before her, she's more than capable of commanding such a large stage, and that absolutely matters for longevity and fandom. Olivia Rodrigo also has the benefit of being an actress before becoming a pop star, and not since early Ariana Grande have I seen an artist effectively leverage that theatricality to her advantage, and using her voice to sell a lot of messy, complicated emotions that might be just below the surface. That's a huge factor for her younger fan base, where it's not just about putting the artist on a pedestal, but relating relating to the stories that she might be telling, leaving with the feeling that she's actually gone through similar messy situations that the audience has. This is where generational framing matters. Olivia Rodrigo is firmly a Gen Z act, and while she's plenty capable of selling a lot of straightforward earnestness, she knows that a certain level of deflective irony or bratty sarcasm will help amplify her appeal for a slightly more sophisticated audience. And by that I mean Gen Z directly. Yeah, I'm calling them a little bit more sophisticated, who would appreciate the disaffection and moral ambiguity, but also find resonance with the anxiety and messy emotions beneath it. There's a lot of factors here that all come together. This is why it also makes a lot of sense that older demographics that might not like her can still find inroads into her sound, especially Gen X, who were around for the last era of self-conscious, semi-ironic, pop-adjacent acts in the mainstream in the 90s. And make no mistake, Rodrigo knows this. You do not open up your debut album with brutal unless you're purposefully trying to tap into a very specific angst and sound that can overlap eras. This is often cited as the primary reason why a lot of older critics really like Olivia Rodrigo, but in comparison with the 80s nostalgia that dominated for damn near a decade in the mainstream, she's tapping into the 90s, alternative nation, and as one of those critics, yeah, you know what, I think there's legs to that argument, but it's a little incomplete. It goes back to the parallel assertion that Olivia Rodrigo has really good taste in the music that she likes and then tries to emulate. Where on playlists and in an interview, she talks about Stephen Merritt of the Magnetic Fields, or the Smashing Pumpkins, or Fiona Apple, or Hole, or even going back further to The Cure or The Smiths, where if you're looking for it, you can find traces of them in her sound, down to Robert Smith of The Cure showing up on this new album. But granted, it's not all she appreciates. Again, Taylor Swift, Hayley Williams, Boy Genius, Clairo, which to me implies that Olivia Rodrigo has stereotypically good taste in so much that it's idiosyncratically hers and hers alone. It might include some odd swerves or contradictions, which funnily enough I respect a hell of a lot more. But that's not often how she's marketed or presented to older audiences, that she's more of that child of the 90s. The press and the promotion accentuates the popular acts that middle-aged folks, especially guys in and around alternative music, would have generally liked when they were her age. And if those folks see a younger artist who also seems to like those older popular alternative acts, where if you're listening for it, you can hear traces of their sound in hers, even if she's a Disney pop star, there's some predisposition of, oh, I mean, she gets it, dude. She's cool. She's bucking the system. She's not like the other girls. Now, is it going to be as thorny or heavy as you got with a lot of grunge or alternative radio in that era? No. And if I were to highlight an immediate, consistent critique of Olivia Rodrigo's sound for all three albums, especially when she touches on rock music, it's gonna be that. Make no mistake, Dan Nigro is a really good pop producer and songwriter. I don't blame him for my general animosity towards Conan Gray when his other credits include Skye Ferreira, Chapel Roan, my favorite Hatchie song, and a lot of Carolyn Polachek. But in my opinion, he took much of Jack Antonoff's brittle expanse and added some more tastefully scuzzy edges, leaving the artist to carry the mix that should have a bit more muscle. And while for Sour, you could argue the sound need to have some edges sanded back for that Disney transition, and that this is by no means a unique problem for her. I say this is a factor for Chapel Roan too, and given her pop influences, it probably even makes sense. But by the time we get to 2026, it's a little bit distracting how the production does not really match Rodrigo's theatrical intensity at the highest volume. To his credit, You Seem Pretty Sad for a Girl So In Love is probably his best production since The Rise and Fall of the Midwest Princess, and that there are fewer questionable mixing and mastering decisions, even if I've got quibbles like the spongy canned synths across Drop Dead or Expectations, or the goopy pulse and the jealous tang of My Way, probably my least favorite song on the album, and the guitars feeling more muted across the whole damn project. But it does lead to a sound where its refined edges even more starkly reflect the past. But what past? The funny thing about nostalgia is that it tends to be a moving target as time and culture moves forward, where despite the critical acclaim that Olivia Rodrigo is receiving right now, would she have received that, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago? Would the tastemakers have been on her side? Well... Part 2, the hipster conversation. Yeah, again. I think part of the reason that the whole hipster conversation around music never goes away, the fact that we're still having it again in 2026, well over a decade after folks called the movement thoroughly dead in the water, is that there's no comfortable consensus. And I'm not about to fix that problem, especially around the comfortable part. There are overlapping descriptors of it, sparking in the late 90s and early 2000s among late Gen X and early millennials, running throughout most of the rest of that decade, going mainstream either midway through or the beginning of the 2010s, and then dissipating broadly into plenty of mainstream millennial signifiers midway through the 2010s. But every single thing I just mentioned, all those details, they can and they will be debated. From what they wore, to what art they liked or didn't like, or liked ironically, but how much does that even matter when you're still consuming anyway? This is where I could well cite a lot of articles that attempt to chronicle the rise and fall of the whole hipster subculture. Mark Greif does a pretty great one for the New Yorker in 2010 titled What Was The Hipster?, adapting from his book of essays of the same name, highlighting the history of the white guys in the 40s and 50s who, by their support of black jazz and rock and bebop and beatnik, in that culture they tried to differentiate themselves from the other white people, you know, the squares, and the split where the semi-ironic appropriation of white trash aesthetics early on in the late 90s and early 2000s then mutated into the semi-bohemian presentation of the mid to late 2000s, and specifically highlights the tension that occurs when 90s era slackers living in cities then encounter the new era of dot-com white-collar workers. Folks that have enough money to buy their way into what they consider good taste and live near the people who had more of it, but who played by enough of the rules to get that money, even if they had that burning underlying resentment for all those rules. A resentment that occasionally can wind into much darker territory. To quote Greif, the hipster aligns himself both with rebel subculture and with the dominant class, and that opens up a poisonous conduit between the two. A lot of it rooted in conspicuous consumption, purposefully defining an outgroup of people, the fetishization of retro and even countercultural aesthetics, but increasingly divorced from the actual ideology that had framed them decades previously, or with connections to other ideologies or movements that could wind up exploitative in their own way. There's a much longer piece about how hipster culture engaged with hip-hop that I briefly touched on in my ASAP Rocky video earlier this year, but this is where we could also insert digressions about hipster fascist or indie sleaze, or how hipster sexism was its own unique poison in this space. It's why it's not surprising that Gavin McInnes co-founded Vice and then the Proud Boys with their white nationalist streak. Or why just after the hipster boom crashed in the mid-2010s, there were so many alt-right folks online who claimed that the right wing was now counterculture. Or why so many right-wing influencers have not gotten rid of the tight pants and skinny jeans that used to be emblematic of a lot of hipster fashion in that movement 20 years earlier. If all you were taking from the hipster era was the aesthetic, some of the music, not what the music might have actually said or the culture informed beyond the vague protest against the man, I get why someone might say this in that space. It's perverse, but on the crudest level, makes sense. Now, to be abundantly fucking clear, this is not me making some broad proclamations about hipster culture contributing to the rise of current-day reactionary politics. It's more complicated, and because I'm not about to give their AstroTurf nearly that much credit. And you could easily map a lot of progressive politics onto hipster culture as well. The softer and more feminine angles embraced in the latter half of the 2000s. The slow embrace of more black and queer art, especially as hipster contrarianism was forced to push its boundaries even wider with the rise of poptimism. To say nothing of a whole lot of great art getting platformed and gradually accepted by the mainstream. That's good. And I don't know about you, I like the mainstream embrace of hipsters, at least trying to broaden the palette of what was considered acceptable and accessible against a fracturing, often conservative-leaning monoculture coming out of Reagan, Clinton, and both Bushes, especially in food, liquor, movies, TV, music. Even if you're going to be an asshole about it, hipsters having a presence in culture as those who implied that there could be better beyond the lowest common denominator, mainstream appeal, it sparked enough regular folks to actually try and find that. And if they were going to be going without ironic deflection or some preening attempt at coolness, you occasionally found genuine quality on the other side. Smaller subcultures and artists that deserve the attention that without the hipsters, they may not have gotten it. But there was always going to be a backlash to the backlash by folks who were thoroughly annoyed by hipster elitism, who thought a lot of them were full of shit anyway. It didn't have much in the way of ideals to really stand on. That it was a cheap photocopy of culture past its prime, and by a lot of guilty white people who need somewhere to channel their privilege in group, or whose fandom was just ironic or disingenuous in order to support that newest hip thing 1 year before throwing it aside the next, often leaving a lot of confused artists and scenes in the lurch that saw themselves get really big and really popular and then not. Too fast to really quantify, especially for those rebel consumers, to quote Thomas Frank in his analysis of how the 60s revolution got commodified, where they thought by buying the right goods with the right logos, with the right insignia, they would signal the right ideals. They'd be part of a social movement instead of just reinforcing capital. And that's kind of the rub now, isn't it? Hipsters were not revolutionary so much as they were in the system. So much of the hipster movement was linked to conspicuous consumption, independent of actual politics beyond the surface, or adversity beyond looking how to spot the right trends and consume better. That you were into things that others weren't, and that had presumed a higher taste and status. That presumably you may have known something they didn't, even if you didn't really. Now, to do all that, you normally need time to consume better, to research. You need access to urban environments, or at least stable transportation and internet. And most often than not, you need money. And I might as well insert my larger digressions about class and taste and cool that I've been writing for years now. Check out my Justin Timberlake and coolness video essay from back in 2023, or my recent one on Noah Kahan and Bill Callahan in a songwriter face-off from earlier this year. Again, I've had a lot to say around this. But the difference is that hipsters often define themselves by who was not in the group. Bubbles, again, that only seem to contract, not expand. And this is where we circle back to that fascinating question. Would Olivia Rodrigo have been accepted by the hipsters of 20, 25 years ago? And this is where I want to expand off of the idea that Greif raises in his piece about the split between tastemakers and the hangers-on, with this argument being that hipsters are far more of the latter category than the former. They weren't really driving taste in the same way. That seems incongruous at first, especially if you consider that hipsters pride themselves being the forefront of taste. Surely there must be some that are better than others, got there first, found great stuff. But the point Greif raises is that there's more that's going to be in scenes and artists that operate independently of whether or not someone decides it's going to be the next big thing. They've got their own sincerely held politics and subcultures. And those scenes inevitably foster the people who will write and critique around them. That's kind of different than when the hipster, who will step in, say it's cool whether they believe it's good or not, or even grasp what the music subculture's doing, then profit off the social capital, and probably move on to the next big thing. The association that Greif draws with hipster is a built-in irony and disingenuousness, a little bit detached from sincerity or depth. And that might be a sticking point of confusion for folks who might have hipster branding become enmeshed with mainstream millennial culture and got a lot more earnest along the way in what they actually liked. But there was gonna be that spore that lingers with folks who are branded as hipsters, or who profess a certain exclusionary taste. And when you consider that a lot of critics happen to like a lot of those same acts hipster did, kind of a chicken or the egg thing, whether hipster contrarianism reinforced certain bands becoming critical darlings, I think it's a bit of both. That they would get pegged with that presumption of being disingenuous in what I'll be honest, we say, especially if it's a sneering dismissal for art they consider as posers or selling out or undercooked. But I want to demystify something for a moment. Music critics, like myself, we might have elitist or at least particular taste, but the arguments that we are contrarian hipsters and then gradually became populist and lost our edge over time in accepting more mainstream pop music, it's not fully aligned with the truth. Certainly not historically if you want to take a look at the big picture. Some publications might have run with that branding because it was real lucrative for them to do so. I don't even need to say their name, they know who they are. But when you consider that not all critics lived in major metropolitan regions, or they were writing for the general public and may have taste that aligns with that public, or at least want to write about things that they know, the reality is that critics at large have praised a lot of mainstream music in some form for decades now, including pop. You can prove it by going back to the old Paz and Jop aggregated polls that the legendary music critic Robert Christgau maintains on his website. There's a lot of material left of the dial, sure, but there's also a lot of the biggest names in music who happen to release a lot of classic albums. They got acclaim then and now, even if they were pop music. Now, were there blind spots for specific genres or artists that probably should have gotten acclaim at their time? Sure, but even with the rise of poptimism, it's still just as true now. An easy example, country music, a genre that's been routinely ignored and disparaged by people who really should know better. It's currently having a very interesting year, damn near a banner year in the mainstream and independently. Do you think it's going to get anywhere close to that sort of attention, or even the time of day, unless you're specifically tied into that ecosystem? So when I asked the question of whether Olivia Rodrigo would have been appreciated in decades past, maybe not for the first two albums, depending how long the stink of Disney might have lingered, but given how much work she did to showcase a more critically aligned taste, by her third album she probably would have gotten there, especially as the vast majority of her influences got that appreciation actually in their time, especially if they were alternative but still accessible, or happened to get a little bit of popular radio. Maybe not by all publications or by all critics at large. Maybe you find a more dispassionate loathing for those who play the mainstream game and you want to be loud and proud about that, but the odds are still in her favor. It's why it's always felt a little disingenuous for those that I've seen so annoyed that critics are praising Olivia Rodrigo now. Whether it was 2026 or 1996, they may have still done so, but there is a little something in being frustrated that she's occupying the press oxygen in a room that could afford to go to other acts who probably needed a hell of a lot more than she does. The argument here becomes rising tide lifts all boats, that writing that review for Olivia Rodrigo might drive traffic to other reviews. Truthfully, I believe that argument less and less in the search engine optimized world, where they'll search for just that and then they will leave. But the flip side is that you write a review for a lesser known act that winds up getting seen by nobody, and they still wind up losing the most. It's those folks who are on the fringes, the independents, who are still suffering under this aggregated world. But what about the hipsters? Would they like Olivia Rodrigo? Well, it depends on who you would ask. The 2000s were not a monolith. There were times when pop acts got slammed relentlessly, especially if they were alternative adjacent but never sold it that convincingly to a slew of the perpetually unimpressed white male rock establishment. And there were times that certain pop acts would get the select special treatment as the one pick so they don't look that pretentious. And then there were the times when folks would claim to like them ironically, especially near the end of the 2000s, only for the true colors to come out, if those ironic fans actually stuck around and became unironic. But where this gets interesting is the assertions from some of those of the next generation of hipsters, the children often of the first, who tend to be even more online and exclusionary with their taste, a broader genre lens except when it's really not, that folks shouldn't even claim that they like this, with a little bit more lip service and class consciousness along the way, along with the expected jabs at a bunch of older critics who are so enamored by this young woman backed up by a major label with all the mainstream support in the world. She's just making disposable, immature pop music. Y'all should be better than this. But is that all this is? Really? So now we get to the album itself. We're following off of my opinions on Guts 3 years ago. It's an album that shows Rodrigo improving across the board for a more consistent and thoughtful experience, but one where I'm also still convinced she's still got another gear to find. I'm not sure it's got the songs at its best to match my absolute favorite of hers. After multiple listens, it's not remotely surprising that it's received so much critical acclaim to date. The production is easily its most polished, despite sounding a little bit underpowered. I already complained about that before. Rodrigo's only growing as a more expressive performer. It is by a considerable length her most cohesive album in its flow, where I'm again on the cusp of really calling it great, but also I will probably call it her most mature. And from a lot of the discourse around the album, you might be a little surprised that I am using that word mature to describe this album at all. Her language is still draped in a lot of teenage histrionics and melodrama, and familiar at that. It's all love songs and breakup songs and relationship whinging. She's wearing baby doll dresses. Really problematic there. And I swear to God, I don't want to make this a thing about media literacy, but I feel like the question of what is the artist trying to do with the decision she makes, it's getting lost behind the I don't like it and I don't care about the reason or the history or interrogating why I'm uncomfortable, just make it stop. But there's always something with ironic consumption that seems to place the objects or the artist or the art of the affection with enough disavowal that you could say you liked them without engaging with what they were actually doing or saying, even if you might have actually believed in it unironically. But belief is different than understanding. The latter requires learning, introspection. And once you clue into what Olivia Rodrigo is actually trying to do, it's kind of startling how seamlessly it all comes together. I mean, take the baby doll dresses. In the 90s, you saw it with Riot Grrrl and alternative acts who were intentionally trying to draw an ironic juxtaposition between the hyper-feminine, coquette-esque fashion and the distorted anger and the feminist subject matter of the art, occasionally running into those that would fetishize them all the same. And Rodrigo seems aware of all that. But there's also another angle that leans into the artistic text on the album, accentuate the perceived immaturity of the album's protagonist. I mean, that was also played up with the teen pop language and subject matter on the surface, and it's very telling how many A, don't consider this to be an intentional decision on her part with any layers or subtext, she's so young she couldn't do that, or B, are just rolling their eyes at the immaturity of it all, where I could copy-paste my comments on how maturity is handled with women in pop from my Avril Lavigne review 4 years ago, where that critique feels very selective compared to male acts and their audiences. Hell, with Rodrigo, it wasn't just assumed that it was fundamentally immature and not worth engaging with further, but that adult critics should be embarrassed for praising it as if there's no sophistication happening. An arbitrary decision made by her corporate handlers, if there happened to be, or if there was anything, it's too trite to even be worth caring about. I mean, so many others clearly do it better. You probably haven't heard of them though, or if you have, and you cock an eyebrow, you probably don't get them the same way I do. Now, if you can't hear the sarcasm, and perhaps if you find the worked over, wordy immaturity of her writing style not to your taste, maybe a few too many flashbacks to the Tortured Poets department, or you find it out of sync with the instrumentation that's deliberately going for an indie alternative sound, drawing back to the 80s left of the dial with the more opulent post-punk that actually survived that decade, to the 90s mainstream alternative breakthrough, or certain acts drawing from those eras historically today, well, I would question how mature any of those influences claim to be, even if the wordplay was putting on more airs, but it is a slightly better argument, I guess. What it immediately told me was that a call to the simpler resonance of the pop of that era, where the lyricism was often not that much deeper if we keep it 100, but also a metatextual response to this. If you're using the sound palette with glimpses at The Cure in the late 80s and the jangling poppier side, especially the sickly, choppy guitars of Maggots for Brains, where she almost doubles down on that for the galloping acoustic Britpop tone of You Plus Me Equals Love, at some point, you gotta expect that turn for disintegration. That older sibling or parent looking through the mirror on the other side and sadly shaking their head, knowing that all this is about to hit a pretty hard brick wall. I mean, she's got to be aware of what she's doing here, setting up that juxtaposition. And in interviews, Olivia Rodrigo highlighted that juxtaposition directly in the quivering opulence of Honeybee. It felt very intentional if you were looking for it. And that is really the key of unlocking You Look Pretty Sad for a Girl So in Love. There is an arc about a relationship starting and ending throughout the course of the album. That's not that special, but the lens has changed. The perspectives changed. If Sour was high school and Guts was early college, this is end of college, first couple years on your own, where you might find that someone where it doesn't just have that superheated teenage feels, but also the possibility they could indeed be the one with whom you might want to choose to spend the rest of your life. It's a crux point where you can afford a little bit more opulence going out, but you're still scraping by. The faster pulsing Taylor Swift-esque patter of Stupid Song with its distinct haggard New York reference just kind of nails that when you go back to your partner's hometown and then meet their family. Find yourself fitting into their life as much as they might try with yours. Where there is still some of that giddy euphoria of a new romance, but it's tempered with, oh my god, this could well be the big one, that makes your heart beat even faster. And yet, even from the early songs, you got enough of a wide-angle perspective that the pursuit of this relationship wasn't always the healthiest. The stalking on the internet from Drop Dead, the creeping rot of maggots for brains, it's pretty obvious there in the text, and he's probably not the greatest guy. And you're looking past a lot to accept him, with a sound never quite having the clearest, happiest burst, and it turns. It starts off with the implication of fights and real-life friction, overcommitments on Purple, but then you realize that even despite feeling so in love, it's only papered over the other issues. And relationships are not going to solve all of them. The Cure absolutely nails this. It's a song that I tangibly bought into the leap in Rodrigo's writing. It's no surprise it's one of her favorites. And that you see all the questionable sides of a partner, and maybe you forgive them a little too much. Or you asked for the wrong things. And the fights pick up steam. What's Wrong With Me with Robert Smith of The Cure playing the desperate romantic foil, it's no perfect for it. Then you get dumped because he loves you enough to know that he's wrong for you, at least at this time. For you to get better, he lets you go. With a spare but effective piano ballad, Les just killer in that lane. And it's heartbreaking to see it all play out. But on another level, it's that half-truth on Les that finally cracks the veneer, with the realization that his justification was on some level bullshit. You know what? Fuck him. You're better. You're gonna set expectations next time. I mean, it certainly fits for the oily new wave snarl of expectations, and maybe you use that as a justification to not learn, at least not in the moment. Or maybe it was the experience you needed to get a little bit more jaded, more adult, more grown up. At least for now. What works here is the ambiguity, where she's using more adolescent language and presentation to show someone younger who's caught up in that sweep, intensify the emotions, but then overlay the real contextualization that neither her nor her partner are the most reliable of narrators. In a questionable relationship where neither behaved all that well, Begged in particular is kind of interesting because the sentiment of you shouldn't have to ask for expressions of love, it's compelling, but ignores the reality that sometimes you need to have more communication beyond the implicit, showing another step that she still has to learn, and that demands a certain amount of maturity to write about all of this critically while still capturing the emotional resonance. It's why the lonely bittersweetness of Cigarette Smoke is so effective. Might be one of her best ever closing tracks, and she's got a couple great ones in that lane. And you know, critics who are willing to engage with the art on its terms will normally pick up on everything I'm saying. None of this analysis is that new. But I'd argue there is another layer. I remember a clip of Brendan Lee Mulligan, the acclaimed sketch comedian, works for Dropout, professional dungeon master, now with Critical Role, where he talks about not steering his infant child towards his own special interest.
My big thing is I'm a nerd, which means I'm passionate about all the things that I'm into. Yeah. And I do not want to put pressure on my child at all to adopt my interests. I want her to spread her wings and fly wherever she goes. But whenever I do see like pointing to a dragon sculpture and being like, dragon? I'm like, yes, exactly. Exactly, that is a dragon. You've nailed it. If you're interested, we can get you 10 dragons, 100 dragons. But I think it's important to monitor in yourself that that is not for your benefit. I think where the enthusiasm comes from when you can see a child gravitate, and this is true also for kids that you work with as a teacher, you work with like in childcare, where it's just, the reason you get excited when they adopt your interests, I think isn't actually necessarily selfish. Part of it is, if you adopt this interest, I can keep helping you.
I think if you're a critic who's older than Olivia Rodrigo, to the point where you might have kids or younger siblings at her age going through the same stuff, there's some of that paternalistic impulse to want to find something to share with someone you care about. A sound you liked at their age, and now they found a variant that's close enough for you to get on board, and presumably safe enough they won't catch the rough edges that you did, especially if they're not like the other girls. They show a little bit more tact and wisdom for their age. I mean, Lorde got that treatment. Billie Eilish got it. Hayley Williams got it. There was even a moment early on where Taylor Swift got it. Where an album like this cuts deeper, while we remember the ups and downs of teenage emotion, the first real heartbreak of your early 20s, when you actually have more skin in the game and you're on your own, that actually hits a little harder. Especially when enough of the presentation evokes sounding younger but aging in real time. It's the one reason why the bittersweet ending really works, because the irony curtain is going back up, but cracked just wide enough to see some real pain on the other side. I don't know, it worked for Courtney, Fiona, Shirley, Polly, Kathleen, both Kims, Alanis 30 years ago. Work here too, right? I mean, there's real empathy there, a shared experience that arguably crosses generations, where if you start dismissing it out of hand, you don't come across like a serious person. And there's a lot of lingering questions as to why the hipster cultural movement either got absorbed into popular culture in the mid-2010s or just died out altogether. I think the easiest answer is kind of staring us in the face. They got older. And when you factor in marriage and kids, suddenly time and money gets a lot tighter. And the pretensions and projections of cool start feeling like they matter a lot less. For some, it became just a phase and they move on with their lives. Maybe with a couple bands and styles and recipes, they wound up meaning something a little bit more after all. Enough that when the reunion tours come around, they can actually afford the tickets. For some, it doesn't go away, but it kind of changes. It becomes the gateway to a world where you actually took that next couple of steps. You found indie rock, but then maybe you went deeper. It stopped being about everything you knew that other folks didn't, and more about the stuff that you love. For lack of better words, the best possible option for hipsters is just becoming nerds, where the irony is long gone and you just find cool underground shit you love, become part of a scene. Maybe pick up some of the ideals that were left behind in commodification and give you a reason to stand for something. Hell, the most thrilling thing as a critic is when the artist themselves reaches out and tells me how much my review of their work got them on the bigger stage, a larger following, there's sincerity there. It's happened more than a few times, nearly 15 years in the game, and it doesn't stop feeling special. So, if you might be like me, you probably only buy the vinyl now at the show, or when you're looking to treat yourself. But you know that it's supporting the artist when streaming doesn't. Hell, I mean, this is the group of older folks who actually still go to the shows, where they reminisce at the back about when they were young. But I think there's a difference between that and those that remember the scene and are really loud about it, but then choose to draw a line about who was part of it and who plainly didn't belong. More focus on the out-group than on the in-group. One thing I noticed is that for as much as folks wanted to exclude stomp clap folk music or any one of a half dozen indie variants, or where they draw as to when hip-hop becomes part of the conversation around hipsters, or metal, or country, or electronica, even pop itself, it's that it rarely felt like it was celebrating the art so much as defining where those people were and who wasn't there. Rarely did I see recognition of others who might have been within the same community and say, hey, me too, that was cool. The 2000s was the era of the internet, after all. The blogosphere was a lot smaller, it was a lot more insular. People remember screen handles and comment sections, in-jokes and memes, and that's before you saw those say, no, as soon as they got featured in Vice or Pitchfork or Stereo Gum, they were over. I liked them before they were big, and it was these bands that never sold out. They were the real tastemakers. They were the ones that mattered, and that circle gets smaller and smaller. You notice the slight undercurrent of bitterness and you feel some sympathy. I mean, how can you not? It feels like you were in a club that just needed a little bit more time and money for accessing it, and you'd be away from all the yuppies in the squares. Time and money that feel all the more precious these days. And limited. But also the creeping dread at recognizing that for all the exclusion, all the trend hopping, all the dismissive above it all coolness, In 2026, what is it getting you? One of the most stark acknowledgments about coolness is that it's fundamentally social, but relies on a certain disavowal. But when more people inevitably wind up leaving or moving on, you might have some great memories. I'm not going to take that away from you. But is it all still cool when nobody's around to share or care? And you could argue the modern Gen Z brand of hipsters are better. They're certainly there. They've got even less money for conspicuous consumption. They're actually smarter in order to coach their irony in better language or tie it to a cause. And they aren't wrong in that some art can drive change downstream, but the conspicuous consumption is built into the social media brand with all its own signposting. And there's a sad, twisted irony that certain lessons have not been learned, especially as it seems like the lesson of their parents was missed all along the way. You can call the critics who like Olivia Rodrigo as embarrassing normies with no taste and they should go be marketing directors rather than tastemakers. A rather ugly jab that, yeah, it does kind of suck that so many hipsters wound up commodifying indie rock while ignoring the institutional factors that made it so in the name of your convenience. But they can't deny two truths. First off, as soon as all the acts that you praise got big, even if they didn't compromise, you might shun them because they're now famous with the wrong people. And woe betide them if they actually did change along the way, especially as it wouldn't really affect you one way or the other. Coolness is always on the move. And second, if your engagement with the art that you disparage is so shallow that you miss the forest for the trees, that you don't even think it's worth the deeper consideration, why would I find your taste compelling? Taste is fundamentally a social construct, good and bad alike, and I don't think I'm all that interested in the antisocial social club. Mostly because I've been around long enough to know a year or 10 later doesn't last. The lazy hipster might leave a beautiful corpse, but they die lonely. Because who's cool enough to come to the funeral if you're not serving, be it the look or lunch? Olivia Rodrigo figured it out long before you did. It's better to love hard and lose harder than to be too good to love true at all, especially when it requires the work along the way. I mean, I don't call that losing your edge. I call it growing